Let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to the college seminar. Dr. Barry Sinervo is our speaker today, and I want to keep the introduction short. He's got one of these CVs that's pretty intimidating. I'm just going to hit the high points. He's a native of Ontario. Grew up in a trilingual home, I just learned, so besides English, he's fluent in French and Finnish. He went to school as an undergraduate at Dalhousie in Halifax, Nova Scotia, if you're not sure where that is. He was a double major in biology and mathematics, graduated with honors. You undergraduates now, he and I were talking about this at supper last night. If you're good in math and you want to do any kind of life science, you cannot have enough math. Get a double major or beyond. Whatever's profitable for you, you can always find uses for it. If I had to do this over again, I would try to do what he did. He left Dalhousie, went to do a PhD at the University of Washington, Seattle with Ray Huey, who does thermal ecology and ecophysiology. Some of you know that name. Finished in 1988, then had a couple of postdocs, the Miller Fellowship at Berkeley, which is a really high-profile, prestigious postdoc. So he postdoced at Berkeley for 2 years, and then 3 more years in 2 different capacities as a research associate and a research fellow with Ray Huey again at the University of Washington. His first academic job was at Indiana University. That was 1992 to 97. He did well there, but he missed the West Coast and lizards and being out in the sun and in the field, so he left Indiana, went to University of California, Santa Cruz, advanced to the rank of full professor there in 2001, I think, and has been there ever since. He's a distinguished professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at UC Santa Cruz. He's also an adjunct with the digital art and new media program there, and he's an affiliated faculty member in computer science and engineering. This is where this math skill pays off. He can do a lot of things us normal mortals can't do. His interests academically, adaptive genetic variation, behavioral ecology, speciation, things like that. He works on lizards. He said when he was in Dalhousie, he did marine stuff and a lot of other things. He was interested in theoretical population genetics until he discovered lizards and what good model organisms they are, so he sort of shifted over, and he does all these things together. He has 102 peer-reviewed works, 86 papers, 16 book chapters, 4 book reviews, 1 book, 2 books in preparation. I only counted the Science and Nature and PNAS publications to keep this brief. 6 papers in Science, 2 in Nature, 5 in PNAS. And he's a member of the consortium that's proposed the Genome 10K project, getting the entire genomes of 10,000 species of vertebrates. We're not going to let the human genome people get ahead of us. And he's done a lot in public outreach, grade school, elementary school level kinds of stuff in Santa Cruz. His son is 7 years old. Among other things at a higher level, NPR and BBC podcast, National Geographic Radio. He teaches game theory, herpetology, behavioral ecology at multiple levels. So let's welcome Dr. Barry Sinervo.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation from the college to come and give the address. Today I'm going to be talking about it's almost like a little detective story. Along the way, I was researching speciation genetics in the lizards of the world. I decided I wanted to take on a small problem. And during this journey across multiple continents, we discovered a whole slew of extinctions. So this is as much about my work in behavioral ecology, natural and sexual selection and speciation as it is about our discovery of these extinctions. And we just published this in May in the journal Science, and you can see that I have a large number of collaborators, too many to list. This involves people located on all 5 continents and in 11 or 13 countries, 11, 12, 13 countries, can't remember which. early in my career, I discovered that the lizards at a place called Los Baños in California actually have 3 distinct throat colors. And this was a bit of an evolutionary puzzle that took me the better part of 20 years to figure out, all the intricacies of it. And I'm not going to go into the evidence for all of what I'm going to tell you is about these lizards, but it turns out to be a fascinating social system, one of the most complex social systems on the planet, and we've used a lot of game theory to figure out the different strategies. In a nutshell, you have rock, which is the orange-throated strategy, and paper, which is the yellow-throated strategy. And so these are genes that actually label up the lizards. So it's as if I have access to a DNA autosequencer, and that's just my eyes. I can actually pick up a lizard and I see a major Mendelian locus. The most interesting aspect of this is the blue males that are actually involved in an incredible cooperative relationship. So we have the aggressive strategy and the deceptive strategy, and the blue males are pitted against these 2 types. The aggressive males, these orange males, will come and invade the territories of the blue males because these are the 2 territorial types. And the orange males are loaded with testosterone, and they're basically like the equivalent of NFL football players. They're more massive in size, and so they can take down a blue male no problem. What's amazing about this part of the story is that this is really a gene for altruism. The blue allele is kind of self-protective. Against the orange male, one male will literally self-sacrifice his life and his fitness. And so this is a genetic version of altruism that we've discovered. It's the very first example of vertebrate altruism that you can link to a gene, a genetic cause. But against the yellow males, it's a mutualism because both blue males do quite well, and the 2 blue males together can shut out the yellow strategy. So this actually turns out to have a really interesting dynamic. If anybody had told me that I'd be working on cycling lizards, this is much of what I would have imagined I'd be doing. It's inconceivable that I would have been doing cycling lizards when I was an undergraduate working on math problems and the like, but it turns out that I was primed for working out the details of the rock, paper, scissors dynamic, which is actually one of the most rapid evolutionary cycles on the planet. And if you count the female strategies, which I have absolutely no time to talk about, that turns out to be a 2-year density cycle that just goes up and down. So in 1989, I started working on the lizards, and we immediately saw the throat colors. In 1990, we managed to get some preliminary behavioral observations on them, and we also started scoring their throat colors. And this shows you the evolutionary sequence. This is a high orange part of this diagram. Up here is the high blue part, and up here is the high yellow part. And the cycle essentially orbits around what's called an attractor. So every 4 to 5 years, the cycle makes an evolutionary pass. As in the rock, paper, scissors game, the strategy scissors is beaten by the strategy rock, and then rock is in turn beaten by the strategy paper, and paper is in turn beaten by the strategy scissors. And in this sense, the altruism, mutualism of the blue males plays a major role in this. And since then, we've seen another 2 orbits of the cycle. I can just overlay on this the next orbit, and the next orbit is overlaid on that. Now, the way this ties into speciation is actually really straightforward. If you have a system like this that's orbiting in evolutionary time, from the work of my graduate student Ammon Coral, we know that some of these orbits have been going on for about 15 million years. So that's a lot of evolutionary action. And in fact, because the strength of selection is actually the strongest selection known to mankind in natural systems, it actually is ripping the lizards apart and rebuilding them every generation in these 3 configurations. And so if we have a cycle like this that's spinning around, every once in a while there are other forces at play that I don't have time to detail for you, but the mate choice of the females can actually push the system to the obvious fixation of, say, an ejection of one of the strategies, and it fixes, say, for 2 or 1. And when it does, the whole genome rearranges quite rapidly. This is one of the fastest speciation processes known. What happens is that the whole genome becomes involved in the rock, paper, scissors game, and when you lose a strategy, you instantly lose a whole slew of alleles that worked well with that strategy but no longer are advantageous in the population. And so a strategy a mating system that only has 2 strategies generates very rapid hybrid unfitness with a population that has, say, 3, or one that ends up fixing for an obvious difference like 2 or 1, like this orange over here in this vertex. So that generates a speciation dynamic, and in fact we've measured 50% hybrid unfitness arising from about 22,000 years of kind of continuous gene flow between populations that have lost one of the strategies and populations that are outside of that that have all 3 strategies present. And you can even see these combinations in this sequence. Now this shows you the results of a student, PhD student in my lab, Ammon Coral, and he's tied the rock, paper, scissors game to the speciation process of the side-blotched lizard. And I just recently got together with Dan Mulcahy, who was a postdoc here in Jack's lab, and he's been working on some of the additional details and the phylogeny. And it turns out that the most common lizard in the western U.S. that everybody thought was 1 species is probably something like 15 species on the mainland. And if you include all the island species, it's probably 25 species. So this is actually incredible. You can compare this with other reptiles that Dan Mulcahy's worked on, like the night snakes, and it has virtually the same geographic area that Euta stansberriana has, and yet you only see about 6 species in that area. So this speciation process of socially mediated speciation, where it's the social strategies that generate the hybrid unfitness, can be actually incredibly rapid, and the speciation rate can jump. And in this case, you can see if you compare it to snakes to the lizards, it's 4 times greater. And in fact, this piqued my interest, and Don Miles and I mapped the occurrence of morphs on all the lizard families of the world. And you can see that where you see rock, paper, scissors, or morphs being color morphs, we know that some of these are now rock, paper, scissors. You see that there are many more, or many higher, the speciation rate is much higher than, say, a closely related sister taxon. If you look at sister taxon pairs, you'll see, say, down here for the Polycrotidae or the Phrynosomatidae, they have many more species and much higher speciation rates than other members of that particular clade. And so this is a highly significant pattern. And so I went in search of other rock, paper, scissors systems to see if they were exactly the same as the side-blotched lizard system. And I went over to look at Europe, because there's a whole radiation over there in Europe and also into Africa of the Lacertids. And there I worked with colleagues Benoit Hulin and Jean Claubert. And Benoit had just worked out the entire phylogeography with his student Jan-Serge Groba. And they had discovered that there are actually 6 clades of the European common lizard. And we went there to look at the color morphs, and we immediately found the 6 characteristic color genotypes that you'd expect for a Mendelian locust that has 3 alleles that virtually parallel the side-blotched lizards. We discovered the same evolutionary cycle. We discovered very good evidence of evolutionary cooperation of the form that you see in the that you see in the side-blotched lizard. Now these groups, the Phrynosomatids in North America and the Lacertids in Europe, have actually been separated for about 175 million years. Snakes are actually more closely related to Lacertids than Phrynosomatids are to Lacertids. And yet we have exactly the same game, essentially. And this led me to work out some other ideas about where I could test this. But as I was doing this work, and I began sampling all of the sites that Benoit had studied with Jan in Europe. We worked mainly in Eastern Europe. What I found was a local extinction pattern that was just obvious, as plain as day. And this is a paper that we have submitted on this. This is the paper we originally submitted to Science and Nature, and they didn't bite because, I don't know, maybe everybody's got climate change fatigue. And this is right now still in review with another journal. Nevertheless, the data that we have in this other paper is even more exquisite for the climate forcing mechanism of demographic collapse due to climate change. And I'll just detail a few of those results here. When I went there, I was interested in the origins of viviparity because I actually had a hypothesis that the origins of viviparity were actually arising from the rock, paper, scissors dynamic. And so I focused on southern France, where you get 2 clades coming together. This is a clade of the viviparous lizards, and you can see they give birth to this encased egg. It's essentially an egg that has no calcium. And here, just in the Pyrenees of the south of France, you actually have normal oviparous lizards, egg-laying lizards. But we found a pattern right away. In 2002, I was sampling a site called the Plana Z, this red spot here where the arrow is, and I noticed that the population was no longer present. We went back and we tried to find these lizards with Jean Clabert, and we couldn't find them there at that site. And so we sampled to this point where we could ascribe a probability of extinction there, a pseudo-extinction probability, of us being wrong and that the lizards were still present of on the order of about p.00001. So we knew that they were probably gone. And I also thought, okay, well, there's a few populations adjacent. So I started studying the populations at Mount Carux in 2002. So I sampled and marked out a population, and I thought, okay, I'm coming back next year to see what's happening with these lizards. And what I found was that in the next year, the population began declining. And it declined precipitously, in fact. And what happened in that next year was that the 2003 canicule occurred in Europe. And that was a heat spell event of such extreme proportions that 35,000 humans died in Europe. 15,000 humans alone died in France. They don't really have air conditioning as a commodity there that they really value. They actually have these old houses with thick walls that provide thermal inertia. But in many places, the adult population, the elderly population, were exposed and died from the extreme canicule. And I thought, as I was watching what was happening to the lizards before my very eyes, I thought, could there be a link between these initial extinctions that I saw? And in the ensuing years, I actually spread across the south of France and throughout Europe, and I enlisted the collaboration of folks in Finland. And this is the data up here from Tuula Oksanen and a whole slew of collaborators in Europe. And we found 15 extinctions of local populations. And they were distributed across all 6 of these species in this species complex. And across all of the major clades. So we were seeing a pattern that was not limited to one particular lineage. It was all across the south of Europe, and it was all in the low elevation populations. If you just plot out logistic regressions and look at the extinction probability as a function of altitude, it shoots way up. As soon as you get below an altitude of 500 meters, you're essentially losing all of the populations there. And below a certain latitude, the extinction probability goes up. The only populations at these latitudes that are protected are those that are at high elevation. And then it also has a signature where it's also much more pronounced in the eastern part of Europe. And in fact, now we've been able to track things. And you know that the Moscow drought and climate warming event that they experienced this summer was, you can project what the lizards are going to tell you about climate, and it actually projected that event. So the lizards are an exquisite bioindicator of events to come because they're experiencing these things and how climate events, like the climate forcing that's occurring because of anthropogenic sources, are interacting with other more interesting aspects of climate, like the North Atlantic Oscillation that actually tends to drive these drought and extreme warm spell events. They're just intensifying now under the effects of anthropogenic climate change. We could link this directly to the heat spells. There's a wonderful database in Europe, in some ways much better than the one we have in North America, where the European Climate Assessment Group has come up with a number of indices, one of which is hot spell index. So this is where if you have for a given stretch of time, let's say 6 days of extreme climate, hot spells, where that temperatures are now greater than the 95% confidence limits, that's defined as a heat spell. And they could be 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 days. They vary. But the probability of extinction for a given location is directly tied into the heat spell indices that you can compute for that location based on the surrounding distribution of weather stations. And we can tie it directly to demographic collapse. You can see density changes at all the sites we've been now monitoring over the last decade, directly tied into this heat spell index. So let me just step back and tell you that this is getting far worse since I began studying this problem. If you plot it now, these density collapses as a function of altitude, which is a very good proxy of the extinction risk. This is the pattern that you see up to about 2006 or so. And it's not too severe. This is the pattern that we've seen in the last 3 years, which have been 3 of the hottest years. 2007 was an extreme drought year as well as a hot year. And 2010 was one of these hottest on record, again, for Eastern Europe, but also it had drought and hot heat events in Western Europe as well. And you can see that the density collapses are so extreme that we're predicting the imminent extinction of many of these populations. And this is nothing that I'm computing as some scientist in the lab. I walk these sites in my hiking boots and my rubber boots looking for the lizards. And I searched the Mount Karuk site, and it is now down to 3 gravid females and a handful of males. And it is destined to go extinct in the next year or two. And there are many other sites like that that we have that we can name by name, and we can follow these populations as they're going extinct right now. So this isn't us just wondering what's happening. We're out there and tracking the progress of these extinctions. So at this point in 2007, where I shifted my focus from Europe to Mexico, I was wondering what had been done on climate change extinctions. And I thought maybe this was just localized to Europe. And these are really the key things that people have worked on in the past decade or so. People have really shown that there are phenological changes, changes in the timing of reproduction, but there really isn't very good evidence of real local population extinctions at either this small spatial scale of metapopulations or a global scale among different continents. And the thing that people have used is often they use proxies for the climate effects. They don't really calibrate their models with actual extinctions. And so we were, in my mind, I wanted to improve on this and really get to a very tight form of evidence. I wanted that the actual extinction should be linked to macroclimate and validated to a biophysical thermal cause arising from climate. And I can see all this in Europe, so I knew what was happening in Europe. Second, the pace of climate change should compromise thermal adaptation, such that evolutionary rates lag behind global warming due to constraints on thermal physiology. In the paper in Science, we proved that. It turns out that the pace of climate change right now is so rapid that as lizards adapt, you have to realize what the process of adaptation is. It's a whole bunch of individuals die or they don't reproduce, and a few do that carry a different trait that's advantageous in that environment. What happens is that natural selection is so severe that too many individuals die that you simply can't sustain a population dynamic, and the population dwindles to extinction because this has been going on for the last 35 years, 40 years. Third, the extinctions due to climate should be global in extent, spanning continents. And I knew that they were in Europe, but I didn't yet know that they were there in Mexico. Now, this is where I came here in 2007. This is why this is a very important place from the point of view of our discoveries. And I came to visit with Jack, and I asked him, not about the climate change extinctions, of course. I said, hey, Jack, what do you know about these color morphs that I've been studying in Europe? We've discovered the rock, paper, scissors game. Do you think there's the rock, paper, scissors game in your lizards? And Jack gave me all of his sites and insights into who to visit and set me up with collaborations. Armed with this knowledge, I went to Mexico. Now, what you have to understand about climate change is, I'm just going to give you the 2-minute abstract about temperature change and how temperatures now relate to what's happened in the past. In 1960, of course, Keeling developed his CO2 measurements on Mauna Loa, but also in the Antarctic. And those turned out to be critical. The Antarctic CO2 measurements that Keeling was making could actually be overlaid with measurements of CO2 that people were getting from ice cores in more recent years. And so we could overlap those two climate change sequences. And so this is where the evidence comes from. It's not just one string of data, it's the overlapping of multiple sequences across multiple timescales. For example, colleague of mine, Jim Zakos, works in the Ocean Sciences Department, and he studies the CO2 record during the Earth's history over the course of 65 million years. I really just point out that you can get an exquisite record, and it's from stable isotope models. Organisms accumulate different isotopes as a function of temperature, so it's like a temperature indicator. When they're deposited in the fossil record, we know what the temperatures were when that organism was deposited. And so this record is really exquisite. There is one event, which is called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And it's thought that the temperature rose by 6 degrees Celsius in 20,000 years. Okay, so that's rapid change, right? We know that temperature has actually risen quite rapidly in the last few decades, but it's projected to rise by perhaps 4 or more degrees Celsius in 100 years. So what we're expecting to see is much greater. We can go through and reconstruct the temperature over the 2 million year sequence. It's all corroborational. We can zero in on those Vostok ice cores or various other ice cores, and there's an exquisite link between the CO2 concentrations and the temperatures that are on the planet at that time based on all these other measurements. They're cross-validated with those benthic foraminifera. And let me show you where we are as far as climate change. We are going to go from here, this is CO2 concentrations, off the scale. It's projected to go like crazy. And what happens to temperature is what we're trying to predict. Let's think about the most recent 2,000-year record, just to put everything into perspective. This is a recent paper by Mann et al. In PNAS, and you can see that we have the famous hockey stick graph. And this is not just from one, say, the tree ring data. The tree ring data suggests there was this warming period during the medieval period. And in fact, this is of interest to me from the point of view of the lizards, because during the medieval period, in the Massif Central, where I'm detecting extinctions right now, they started growing wheat. It was warm enough to grow wheat on that high elevation plateau. And then they could no longer grow wheat for a long time. And in the 1990s, the farmers discovered that they could now grow wheat. But they're only going to be able to grow wheat for a very short period of time because it's going to get drought and hot temperatures that will no longer sustain the wheat. See, this is an irrigation crop that you can either irrigate or you use some sort of dry farming techniques, and it was dry farming that they use up in the Massif Central. In about 10, 20 years, that wheat will no longer be possible to grow. But what we can see is that this hockey stick graph, from multiple sources of evidence, is telling us that the change is rapid right now. How do they predict climate change? Well, you use these supercomputers to figure out thermal exchanges in these little boxes that you model across the planet. And so you develop a map of the thermal changes. You sum those out, and you can use various scenarios for CO2. So you can predict where we're going to go from this point right here up into the future. So these are different scenarios that the IPCC has put together. And this kind of gives you a sense. This is from the IPCC fourth climate assessment. And this is what's happened in the historical record. If we assume no anthropogenic forcing mechanisms, we have a null model of climate change that basically should stay flat. We can actually look at the observed change, and the pink is the predicted change from these climate models, and it really registers nicely across all of the continents. So that essentially validates these supercomputer models that these climate scientists are using to predict things. They then come up with these scenarios for the future, given these climate forcing effects in both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. And so this is one of the worst case scenarios if we kind of go along at our merry way without doing anything. And I contrast that with a change that might be adopted under very stringent sorts of governmental limits on CO2 production. They have very different consequences. And I'll actually show you two extinction scenarios. Extinctions in the year 2050 and 2080. And basically, you can think about those as these two scenarios. If we look at and limit climate change, we'll actually be able to limit the temperature changes that occur, and we'll keep the extinctions at that 2050 level. So they develop these climate surfaces, and at this point, I enter into the picture, and I'm wondering, can we predict the extinctions in Europe? But I'm not sure that this would convince anybody. And I discover the extinctions in Mexico after heading on some expeditions that back to Jack Seitz' graduate student study plots. And this shows you, this is my own investigation of climate records now. There was a great deal of skepticism a year ago. There's ClimateGate, what have you. I went and got my own records for Mexico and looked at the climate changes that had occurred in Tmax, which is the maximum air temperature. And the red shows increases that are measured in tenths of a degree, but if you sum those up over 35 years, you're going to see a 3.5 degrees C increase in the red areas on average. But it's concentrated, right? The thing about climate change that you have to realize is that it's not like 1 degree Celsius over the entire Earth's surface that's going to kill something. It's like when the changes occur during the phenology of an organism. And this shows you that January, February, March, April, May are excruciatingly hot in Mexico. And in some of these places, some of these stations are registering 4 to 7 degrees C increases during some of those months. There's no change in the minimum temperatures in Mexico. So it's all during the heat of the day. That's where you're seeing the increases. So the nighttime temperatures kind of just are keeping that average down. And then there are really no big changes that are occurring during the summer months. It's mainly during the spring and winter, which is incidentally when lizards in Mexico reproduce. So we go back and we use those predictions then across the globe. There's this a number of databases that you could use. I ended up using the one here in North America, the worldclimate.org database, because there was, again, considerable controversy over the Hadley Center database, even though they show exactly the same thing and they're independently derived. I just used the World Climate database. There were 24 extinctions at 200 sites that we surveyed over the last 3 years across 48 species of Mexico. And this was a devastating finding that we had. This essentially, when I call back to talk to Jack about this, his heart drops because I'm telling him about sites where many of the species are now extinct at those sites. And in fact, some of the species he worked on are likely to go extinct in the next decade. And you can see that the extinction risk is much greater for viviparous species compared to the oviparous forms. And the viviparous species are the blue line, the oviparous forms are the red line. And this is because the viviparous species are adapted to the montane environments of Mexico, those high elevation sites where climate change has actually been the greatest, the hottest changes. This shows you the actual observed extinctions in oviparous forms and viviparous forms on contour plots, and you can see it's distributed actually in mountain ranges. And you can see the pattern as a function of elevation versus latitude. That just shows you that there is a very strong signal of both latitude and elevation. And you tend to get them concentrated, say, in the south here. But if we run the tape forward with these climate scenarios, you can see that the areas of extinction are just going to grow dramatically. And from these, we can actually then start to predict species extinctions. And by the time we get to, say, 2069, the only lizards are going to be that are viviparous are going to be present in the central mountain ranges of Mexico. And that's even true for some of the oviparous forms. There are going to be some lowland populations, and these lowland lizards actually, incidentally, have a high body temperature, right? They're immune to it because they're adapted to the hot. The lizards that aren't adapted to these changes are those that are in the mountains. Now, this is just the hypothesis that we had for developing the model. The hours of restriction during breeding is the cause of demographic collapse. So if you look at the time of day, you can actually instrument sites to figure out how hot lizards get by just putting out a little gray model. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And this, you can distribute them around the environment and figure out the minimum temperature that a lizard could be and the maximum temperature that a lizard could be. And the gray area shows you when it'll be active. And this is before climate warming, and this is after climate warming. And this restriction in activity during the breeding season is what we think essentially causes the demographic collapse. All that change that's concentrated in the spring months. And Fausto actually had some key natural history observations. Fausto observed that a closely related species ceased reproduction in 1998 when the hottest spring temperatures ever recorded hit weather stations surrounding this particular population of Scaloporus mucronatus at Zoquiapan. So we had some really key natural history observations totally related to the ones that I had in Europe. This is just Fausto's brilliant idea. You put out these little models and test what it looks like now at extinct sites. And this is the number of hours that it's hot. Too hot to essentially be foraging. And you're stuck in a retreat site, unable to forage and yet hot because you can't get away and you're waiting for the environment to cool down. Whereas at sites where the lizards are still present, you can see it's still a bit cooler. Though this is right on the threshold of what pushes them over extinction. 4 hours for this particular species. From that, we could develop, just like the climate scientists develop their temperature maps, we just convert their temperature maps, because lizards are just thermometers, right? But a biological thermometer to extinction maps. And so this shows you the pattern of extinctions for lizards that are 29 degrees Celsius versus those that are between 29 and 32 degrees Celsius versus those that are between 32 and 35 degrees Celsius. You see fewer extinctions, of course, in the contemporary record, supposedly, but also it's much more intense extinctions that occur in these lizards that are low body temperature, and these are the montane ones, the ones that are adapted to the cooler climates. Now, for this global extinction model to actually tie this in, this is just theory, right? Because we don't tie this directly into where lizards are located. It turns out that physiological ecologists have traveled around the world, and all these little red dots are places where somebody measured the body temperature of a species. Knowing the body temperature of the species, knowing the thermal changes that have occurred, the changes in Tmax, knowing the hours of restriction then from those relationships, we could predict the extinctions. And then we could actually validate those extinctions with additional data on these taxa, the Lacertids of Europe, where we started to observe the extinctions, the Scaloporus of Mexico, and then we also found colleagues that were working on Lialemus and Phymaturus, the Lialemidae, through Jack. He'd been working there for the last decade on the radiation of lizards in South America. I contacted some folks in Australia because we actually heard people writing about extinctions that seemed to have no attributable cause in the Great Desert of Australia, and so we worked on the Skinsidae of Australia, and also the Chordilids and Gyrosaurids of Africa. And we compared the reliability of our predicted extinctions to those that others had observed and we had observed on those 5 continents. And the model is 72% accurate. And where we see errors, we already know that if we just build in drought effects, we can actually explain those mismatches between just the temperature model. And also another effect that we didn't even account for in our global predictions, the dire predictions, were that in Mexico we already observed that about 1/4 of those 24 extinctions we could not predict by the thermal model. It just didn't get hot enough at those sites to predict the lizard's demise. But what we did see was that at 6 of the 8 sites where we couldn't predict thermal extinctions, we saw the range expansion of a competitor. And we're pretty sure that that competitor drove the lizards that were the upland species extinct. So this was a lowland species going to the upland, driving the lizards extinct. So if you take the numbers I give you and just multiply it by 1.25, you'll actually get at the real numbers for extinction, my best guess. But we haven't yet built the models to account for those effects. So this is just extinction kind of by the pictures. This is the species that are now registered as going locally extinct because of climate change. Madagascar actually has a large number of species that we discovered in another couple of papers. So we included this in the mix, and here are a couple of the Skinsidae, and of course in the Phrynosomatidea of Mexico and these Lialemids here. This is, if you take all the known locations of a lizard and say when those locations all go totally extinct, we're going to lose a species. So this is the species that are predicted to go extinct as a function of the local extinctions. I just show you the local extinction maps here, but these are just the species. So not too many, actually. Only about 5% of species will go extinct by the year 2050. If we allow climate change to progress at its merry pace without any changes, and we don't change it now, we're going to see these kinds of changes by 2080. 20% of the world's species will go extinct. And this is based on all the lizard families of the world. So extinction by the numbers. We now are seeing 4% of the local extinctions in some areas, 6% of species extinctions by 2050, 20% of species extinctions by 2080. And if you adjust these by the competition-induced extinctions, that's going to be a bit higher. If you adjust these by the drought-induced extinctions that have a thermal cause, that's going to be even higher still. So these are conservative estimates. We're also doing research at demographic timescales because we realize there are a lot of skeptics out there, and we have direct evidence of this process. We're looking at the side-blotched lizard, which is present here in North America, Urosaurus graciosus, very high local extinctions. It's going extinct in sites in the Mojave Desert and other deserts in Arizona. We have 6 of 20 sites where we've observed local extinctions. In Lacerta vivipara, we're tracking those local extinctions. I'm watching populations go extinct right before my very eyes. Iberal Lacerta in Europe, it's a new species we've added to the registry. We've already detected local extinctions, and we predict there's one Iberal Lacerta species that is found adjacent to Madrid. It's got a 26-kilometer maximum range. It's one of the most endemic montane endemic species of lizards in the world. It should be extinct within the next 10 years. And we're also tracking the extinctions in Mexico. As my graduate students go down to Mexico, we see more and more of those. This just gives you a sense of what we're trying to figure out with our latest research. We're actually sampling the changes that are occurring across this gradient from Mexico on up to Washington State. And this is the temperature that we've seen. And we actually predict quite a few extinctions of many lizards in Texas. So we're actually probably in the next 10 years, we're going to push species. We could probably put species on the endangered species list from climate change in the next 5 years. And 5 years later, they're going to be extinct from the U.S. Some of those may still be present in Mexico, but shortly thereafter they're going to go extinct. So we're looking at a time horizon of 5 to 10 years, and lizards could be listed because of climate change, and then they're going extinct from climate change, and there's nothing we can do about it. This just shows you that spreading wave of extinctions for the side-blotched lizard, which isn't going to go extinct, but it's a model for studying these effects. We already see extinctions in Death Valley, the hottest place in North America, one of the hottest places in the world. So we verified extinctions here, we verified extinctions here, and we have yet to verify these extinctions. But this is just a nice model species that we can use. And we're also doing this experiment in the Pyrenees. A colleague of mine, Jean Claubert, built these really cool Metatrons that are 10 meters by 10 meters, and we're actually going to study the thermal physiology of extinctions, both temperature and humidity experimental manipulations on extinctions as little demographic units go extinct from climate change. We can manipulate climate change. We can go into current scenarios or historical scenarios with various shade and humidity controls. So we can prove these effects in experiments as well. We also have available to us the oviparous lizards and the viviparous lizards, so we can show that, yes, it is indeed the viviparous lizards that are at the greatest risk, and we can prove all these things with experiments. So here's the bottom line. Tropical and subtropical lizards are toast, as are special cases in the temperate zones, and vivipar species face the highest risk of extinction. It's these montane endemics. And if we bend that CO2 curve, we limit damage to 5%, not the 20% of species extinction. And it's trivial to do this bending. All you have to do is conserve. I'm on a plan where I reduce my CO2 levels, my footprint, by 15% a year for the next 5 years, and I get myself down to 50%. I've already been biking my whole life to work. I bike 25 miles a day on my bicycle. I get an hour of exercise in and an hour of exercise back. I do certain things like go to farmers markets. It's trivial to drop your CO2 curve. It's just trivial behavioral changes. So take control of yourselves and change yourself and drop yourself. Say, I've got a limit for myself of 10%. That drops your personal CO2 down to 60% after 5 years. It's trivial. It's trivial. Companies are doing it. It's energetically efficient to do it. Companies are actually saving millions, billions of dollars. Europe is so far ahead of us, ahead of the US, it is actually quite pathetic. So that's just my little rant about this and what we can do. We can empower ourselves. This is the first address I've given to adults. I give this address and I don't try to scare the children. I give it to kids in France and I tell them, you can change. When you leave a room, turn out the light, whatever you can do. It's simple. Bicycle to school. Do those simple things. And the kids are self-empowered to change the world. If we all do this, we change the world. That's it. That's the only thing that's going to stop it. So I don't want to leave it all that depressed. We're going to be looking at these extinctions, but the real reason I wanted to study this was the speciation of the rock, paper, scissors game, so I'm just going to briefly return for 1 minute. There are going to be changes to all kinds of organisms. It's not just the lizards. It's snakes. They're already starting to go extinct. We have definite evidence of it. Amphibians extinctions, coral reef bleaching and death, Southern Ocean krill, salps, and whales, zooplankton and phytoplankton. They're all changing. And we're just standing here doing nothing. At that, I would like to point out that if we don't do nothing, then, they turned off my sound. Let's try this again. Oh well. Let me say this, because I'm me. You got to think like a lizard to survive in this game. That's what it's going to be if you don't change, because it's going to be anarchy, right? Okay, just a quick thing. The rock, paper, scissors game does drive speciation. It is the engine. It actually leads to the evolution of viviparity. We did discover that in Mexico. The little orange are the new species of rock, paper, scissors lizards that we've discovered. And in fact, the speciation rate is in fact way higher. I just pick out Jack's favorite organism here. This is the Grammicus that Jack works on, and he'll probably be able to tell you this story in a couple of years' time. But if you look at the speciation, the number of species that are present in the Grammicus versus its sister group, it's way higher. For every time we see the rock, paper, scissors game originate, it generates many more species by that process. The interesting thing is that it actually has a tendency to generate viviparous species. So by studying the rock, paper, scissors game, we're actually going to those hotspots where speciation is occurring to try to capture this genetic variation before it's lost to science for all time. And it will be lost. There is now this pressing need to go to these places and study the species that are now going extinct. The Amazonian basin is a bit of a bloodbath from the point of view of species extinctions. I'm almost afraid to go visit some of those sites. These are just some eye candy just to show you what we'll be losing. This is Scoloporus minor, a trimorphic species that's virtually identical. It looks like these things were dipped in paint. This is some species that have fixed on blue or fixed on red. This is a cartoon. Can this thing really exist in nature and survive? It looks more like a clown color. This actually turns out to be likely to be trimorphic and giving rise to all kinds of cool colors. This is a dimorphic species where you see it in the males and females. The sister to this is probably going to go extinct in 10 years. It's fixed on monomorphic and it's viviparous. And this is the last photo I'll show. This is Scoloporus mucronatus. And this turns out to be a bunch of cryptic species in all likelihood. We're trying to figure out how many, but you can see why they go extinct. These cloud forests of Mexico are now totally changing. We're losing the cloud forests. So these lizards are now baking under the sun. The forests are no longer protection. The fog is gone. They're baking, and they're dying. And that's basically something that the only change we can make, there's nothing we can do to bring fog in, right? We can only try to bend the curve to limit the damage. At that point, I'll open the floor to questions. Yes?
How would you distinguish between a local extinction and a migration, between temperature-induced extinction and land development extinction? And why would you expect so much extinction in the equator when most of the temperature changes are at the poles?
So there's three parts to the question. How do you distinguish between a temperature-induced extinction and a migration? Lizards don't migrate. In fact, I've published extensively on the dispersal distances of lizards. They're incredibly philopatric. The nice thing would be to say, oh, the lizards are moving up the montane slope and they're going to be present there. It turns out that that's not going to be likely because they're found in little pockets. The European common lizard is found in isolated bogs, and once they're extinct from that bog, they're not moving to the next bog. It's too far. The next part of the question was, what was it again? It was land use. All of our extinction surveys were actually done at sites where we still essentially had pristine habitat. So we weren't looking at land use changes. We actually restricted it to national parks in Africa and many other places where we haven't seen any dramatic land use changes. If you factor in land use changes like forest clearing, say in the Amazon basin, you can actually compute additional extinctions. It turns out that when you clear a forest, the temperature in the area into the forest adjacent to that cleared area jumps by 2 degrees C. So you can actually double the effective rates of heating with those kinds of changes. So it's worse when I actually run the numbers with any land use changes. And then the final part of it? The equator. It turns out that the equator is essentially heating up. Everybody thinks that it's heating up really quickly in the temperate zone, and that's because it's pretty cool in the temperate zone. The problem is that a little change at the equator is devastating because it's a uniform temperature, and there's no escape from, say, warming climate. We actually have the benefit of being in the temperate zone, and many of the lizards will actually adapt to climate change by changing their season to breed earlier. That doesn't happen in the equator. They're essentially tied into certain kinds of breeding schedules that are independent of temperature. So they're photoperiod based. So we actually expect to see this kind of process. And in fact, other folks have projected that the tropical lizards are at greater risk of extinction. And these are other physiological ecologists that have been working on lizards for a while. So we just confirm their finding, their conjectures. Any other questions? Yeah. Sexy lizard has different colors, right? And those colors have meaning. And so what I study is the behavioral ecology and the meaning of signals. And so an orange male is actually selected for how bright his orange is and how that is linked to other traits that enhance his performance. Interestingly enough, the cooperative males are actually favored by females for the attributes that enhance their ability to cooperate with other males. And females carry the same genes for recognizing cooperative males that the cooperative males recognize. And so cooperative type females mate with cooperative type males. And that's an important thing that actually can drive the speciation dynamic to fixation for cooperative types. And then the yellow males actually have these sneaky signals. They're female mimics. And it turns out that females prefer yellow males that have the best female mimicking characteristics because they not only will produce good sneaky male sons, but they're carrying a lot of genes that are female benefit genes that enhance the fitness of their daughters. And so they use those. So there's actually, that's a great question because it gets into the details of a lot of what we know about the mating system dynamics of the lizards and things that they prefer. And we published extensively on those. Yeah.
So are there differences in species that have the three color morphs and those that are fixed on one in their probability of either being in a location that they're likely to go extinct or being more vulnerable to that, to less ability to change rapidly?
That's a great question. It turns out that most of the species that are trimorphic are actually lowland species that are at very low risk of extinction. And what's happened during the last years, you know, the millions and thousands of years of history, is that when an opportunity arises, an upland species can be born from a speciation process from a lowland species. And when that happens, it turns out that they're predisposed to either evolve egg retention or the more extreme version of that, which was viviparity. And so that the lowland species are actually, the rock, paper, scissors types, are less likely to go extinct, but their daughter species are the ones that are the most likely to go extinct. And that's because they give rise to these viviparous types. So that's just nailing exactly the biogeographic effect that we've discovered. And we've discovered that in Europe and Mexico, and I have all these trips planned to all these other parts of the world like India and Malaysia to nail that pattern in greater detail.
What are some of the big CO2 limiting initiatives that the U.S. can take to be more like Europe, or what Europe can do better?
It's really trivial things like limiting gas emissions from cars, so being more strict about the gas limits that are on cars. If you look, there are various graphs that show that the progress being made towards limiting CO2 production, and Europe is really the only place in the world where those limits are going down, and that's because they've been very aggressive about themselves limiting things. France is actually quite unusual. It is one of the It started out with the lowest carbon footprint because they use a lot of nuclear power, so they don't have any coal-fired stuff going on. It's either water, hydroelectric, or nuclear. I mean, those are the solutions that we face in the short term. Looking at coal, to be able to burn coal for the next 500 years, yeah, that'll work. I mean, that'll keep the savages at bay because the rest of the world around us is likely to collapse. I'm not predicting a dire collapse for the U.S. What I'm talking about is how climate will actually drive the third world and many of those places to the point of anarchy. And we don't need to change things in the U.S., but to become more energy conserving. That really does a lot. And it's not even like, I need to do this right now. It could be 5% this year, 10% this year, at an individual level. It has to be at an individual level, but individual companies are doing this because there is, in fact, incentives to them. I mean, to go green. That's just very clear. Companies that adopt that platform in their perspective on how they're going to treat the planet. So really, it's not complicated. It's looking at conservation everywhere, and we actually could get back to 1970 levels. Very easy.
Two quite different questions. I may have missed this. You may have said it. Widespread species have embedded rock, paper, scissors within their range. There's a widespread species.
Yes.
And the rock, paper, scissors game is played better at lowlands?
In some places, yes, like in Mexico, it's typical of the more lowland species, and the upland species tend to fix on things. And they become endemics, like to one mountain range.
And so the widespread species remain a pool from which you can
Oh, in some sense, yeah, that process takes millions of years. Yeah, we can map it out. Yeah, it's a totally different time scale. So,
Then the second question, so this is a little bit more bizarre. Can we look at a rock, paper, scissors game with responses to carbon emissions? France is playing a game, we're playing a game.
there are actually human.
China is playing a
I,
game.
I work with an economist. We teach game theory, and there's actually a well-known common investment game that's a rock, paper, scissors game. After we published our game, the rock, paper, scissors game in lizards, people developed an interest in it, and one of the earliest human games that was developed was invest in a common pool, which is basically like all of economics. And you have a cooperative strategy that is cooperatively investing, and that strategy is vulnerable to strategies within which take from the other players that they're playing with a cheat strategy. That cheat strategy is actually beaten by a loner go-it-alone strategy, and so on and so forth. The unfortunate thing in this game is that the only thing that's going to work is the cooperative game. And that's what I truly hope we end up fixing on, like the lizards do in some splendid places where they evolve splendid forms of evolutionary cooperation. We can do it with culture.